The fleet came out of transit like a fist opening in the dark. One moment there was nothing above the blue planet. The next, 43 ships hung in orbit. War cruisers the length of small cities. Troop carriers packed with soldiers who had not yet been needed. 3 command vessels so massive they bent the light around their edges. They appeared all at once, in perfect formation, and they blocked out a section of stars, the way a hand blocks out a candle. Fleet Commander Zarek Vel stood at the forward window of the lead ship and looked down. He had done this 43 times. The planet was blue and green, wrapped in cloud, with one pale moon sitting off to the side like a loyal dog. He could see city lights on the dark side, small orange clusters scattered across the surface, warm and quiet. He had looked down at lights like these before. They always looked the same from up here. Warm, alive, unaware. He gave them 6 hours. 6 hours was the standard. Enough time for them to look up, to count the ships, to understand the shape of what was happening. Enough time for whatever passed as a leader on this planet to do the math. The math was always simple. The math always worked. He had never, in 43 campaigns, seen a civilization find a way around it. He went to his quarters and read the file on this species. They called themselves humans. 1 planet, 1 moon. No colonies beyond a small space station that could hold, at most, 6 of them at a time. No faster than light travel. Their weapons technology was roughly 200 years behind Vale standard, which meant it was impressive by their own measure and irrelevant by his. They had managed to split their own atom, which most species eventually did, and they had built weapons around that. The file noted they had quite a lot of these weapons. More, the analyst had written in a small note at the bottom, than seemed necessary for 1 planet. Zarek Vel read this, then moved on. He had seen nuclear weapons before. He had seen what they could do on the ground. From orbit, they were not a concern. He finished the file, ate a meal, and returned to the forward window. His communications officer turned from her console. She looked mildly puzzled. "They've responded, Commander." "Terms?" "No terms. They want a direct channel." She paused. "They responded in 40 minutes. He looked at her for a moment. No civilization had ever responded in 40 minutes. 6 hours was the standard because 6 hours was how long shock took to become reality and reality took to become words. 40 minutes was not shock. 40 minutes was not acceptance. He did not know what 40 minutes was, but it did not feel like what he was used to. "Open the channel," he said. They put him in a white room. A table, 2 chairs, nothing on the walls. The kind of room that told you nothing about the people who made it, which was either very smart or very careless. His holographic image was projected on their end. On his end, he could see her clearly. The human was a female, not young. Her hair was gray at the temples and cut short. She wore a military uniform with nothing on it, no medals, no rank decorations that he could read, just the plain fabric of the thing. Vial commanders of her apparent seniority wore their history on their chest. She wore nothing. She sat with her back straight and her hands flat on the table, and in front of her was a printed copy of the subjugation terms his fleet had transmitted. She was reading them, not pretending to read them. Actually reading. Her eyes moved line by line down the page. She had a pen in her right hand, a simple one, the kind used for putting marks on paper, and she was writing in the margins. Zarek Vel waited. She turned a page. She wrote something, turned another page. In 43 campaigns, no one had made him wait while they took notes on their own surrender terms. Some cried. Some talked without stopping. Some sat in silence because silence was the only thing left. No one had ever treated the moment like a document to be reviewed. She turned the last page. "Read it." "Put the pen down." She looked up at him. Her eyes were brown, very still. The eyes of someone who had already made a decision and was now simply dealing with the next part. "I've read your terms," she said. Her name, he had been told, was General Amara Osei. She commanded what Earth called its Defense Council. "They are standard," Zarek Vel said. "Non-negotiable." She nodded once. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. As if he had confirmed something she already knew. "Full political control of the planet transfers to the Vale Dominion," she said, not reading from the document, just saying the terms from memory. 40% of our yearly resource output becomes tribute. Our military is dissolved. Our leaders serve in an advisory role with no actual authority." She paused. "And paragraph 14 says that any organized resistance after signing is punishable by the destruction of a civilian population center." That is correct. She was quiet. She looked at the document once more. Then she looked at him. The pen was still in her fingers. He could see that it had been chewed on. At the top, where a pen is held in the mouth when a person is thinking hard. The chewing was old. The pen had been chewed on many times, over many months, in many long meetings. She put it down. "We respectfully decline," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You understand what that means," he said. "Yes." "You've seen the fleet above your planet." "Yes." "Then you understand what comes next." "Yes," she said. Her voice did not change. Her hands did not move. She was sitting the same way she had been sitting when he first saw her, and she looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they have already accounted for. "I expect we do." He chose a coastal city on the edge of a large ocean. It had about 1.5 million people. He chose it because it was large enough to be understood, and far enough from their capital, that the government would survive the lesson. That was the point of the lesson. The government had to survive it. They had to feel the shape of what losing would look like before they chose not to lose. The bombardment lasted 4 minutes. When it was done, the city was simply gone. Not ruins, not fire. Gone. A crater where buildings had been, and steam rising from the ocean where the water had rushed back in, and a silence over the planet that he had heard before, in 12 other campaigns, a silence that sounded like a civilization counting its own dead and understanding the arithmetic for the first time. He had done this twice before. Both times, within the hour, a channel opened. Both times, the first word on the channel was surrender. He waited for the channel to open. It didn't open. He waited 1 hour. He waited 2. His communications officer kept checking the array and looking at him with a small line between her eyes. The channel didn't open. What came instead, 3 hours after the bombardment, was data. His long-range sensors were picking up signals from across the planet's surface. Movement. Coordinated movement, not civilians running from something, not the chaos of a population in shock, but organized, deliberate, simultaneous movement across 6 separate land masses. His tactical officer started marking the signals on the display and stopped talking, which was the thing she did when what she was seeing did not fit into any category she had a name for. "Commander." He walked to the display. He looked at what she was looking at. Power signatures activating across the planet. Not civilian power, hospitals, government buildings. Different. Facilities that had clearly been built for a specific purpose and had been sitting, waiting, for a long time. Waiting for exactly this. His tactical officer was young. She had been on 6 campaigns. She was good at what she did. She was looking at the display like she didn't know what she was looking at. "They're mobilizing," she said. He stood at the display and looked at the signals. His mind, which had spent a long career getting very good at reading the shape of military situations, turned the data over. He looked at the spread of the activation points, the speed of the coordination simultaneous across 6 continents, as if the signal to begin had been sent and received at the same moment everywhere, as if they had been waiting for the signal for a long time, as if they had known the signal was coming. He pulled up the file again. 1 planet, 1 moon, no FTL, primitive, by every standard his civilization used. He read the note again. More nuclear weapons than seemed necessary for 1 planet. He thought about the general. He thought about the 40 minutes. He thought about the pen with the chewed-up top, and the margin notes, and the way she had looked at him when she said, "Times we respectfully decline times," not like a person who had just refused something, but like a person who had already moved past it to the next step. She had known what would come after she said no. She had sat there and said it anyway. He thought about what you write in the margins of your own subjugation terms. What matters enough to write down in 40 minutes? What does a person note when they're reading the document that is supposed to end them? He did not know. His communications officer spoke from across the room. Her voice was very careful. "Commander, they're not opening a channel." He didn't answer. He looked at the city lights on the dark side of the planet. Still burning. 1.5 million of those lights had just gone out, and the rest were still on. And below those lights, whatever this species was, they were moving. They were not sending messages. They were not asking for more time. They were not doing any of the things that every other civilization had done in this moment. They were doing something else. "Get me their full military history," he said. His voice was very even. "Everything we have." His tactical officer turned to her console. She brought up the records. She looked at the results for a long moment, without speaking. Then she turned back. "Commander," she said, "how far back would you like me to go?" He looked at the planet one more time. Outside the window, the stars were very still and very far away. "All the way," he said. His intelligence officer, a young analyst named Sareth Ka, spent the rest of that night reading. She was in her cabin, surrounded by data on her screens, and she read without stopping. She read about a species that had been in organized conflict with itself for more than 10,000 years, without pause. She read about wars that had killed hundreds of millions of their own kind, not in accidents, not from illness, but deliberately, in campaigns they had planned and executed against each other. She read about weapons they had built specifically for killing each other in new and more complete ways. She read about the fact that at any given point in their recorded history, some portion of this species had been at war with some other portion. They had a word times, veteran times, for a person who had already been through a war and chose to go back to another one. The word was said with respect. Sareth Ka sat in her cabin, with her screens full of data, and a cold cup of something she had forgotten to drink, and she looked at the word, and she looked at what it meant, and she sat with it for a long time. She was still sitting with it when the sun rose over the planet below. She opened a new file on her console. She labeled it simply, Anomalies. She did not sleep. Sareth Ka delivered her first report 10 days after the fleet arrived. She stood in the briefing room in front of Zarek Vel and his senior officers, with her data on the large display behind her, and she was calm for exactly the first 3 minutes. She went through the basics: planet size, population, resource output, the structure of their governments. She used her careful analyst voice. She kept her hands still. Then she got to the history. This species has been in continuous armed conflict with itself for approximately 10,000 years, she said. There is no period in their recorded history, not one decade where some part of the population was not actively fighting another part. She let that sit for a moment. For comparison, she said, the Vial concluded our last internal conflict 800 years before our first expansion campaign. The Galactic Council average for the end of internal warfare among its member species is 600 years before first contact with another civilization. She looked at the room. Humans have never stopped. She clicked to the next slide. Their weapons development reflects this. They have dedicated more of their industrial and scientific output to the design of weapons than to any other single field, including food production, medicine, or infrastructure. They currently possess enough nuclear weapons to destroy their own planet's surface several times over. The room was quiet. Several times, one of the senior officers said. Several times, Sareth Ka confirmed. The most common explanation, in their own historical texts, is that having enough to destroy the world once was not considered sufficient. There needed to be enough to be certain. She had more. She had a great deal more. She went through it all: the wars, the weapons, the industrial capacity they could redirect toward killing when they needed to, the way their history showed, again and again, a species that faced destruction and responded not by surrendering but by rebuilding and coming back. She showed records of wars where they had lost millions in a single engagement and kept fighting for years afterward. She showed a term they used in their military culture: no surrender. Not as a boast, she said carefully, as a philosophy. When she was done, the room was very still. Zarek Vel looked at the data on the display for a long time. Then he looked at Sareth Ka. Your assessment? He said. She had been awake for 30 hours. There were dark circles under her eyes, which in her species showed as a slight blue tinge in the skin below. She looked at her commander, and she said what she had been trying to figure out how to say for 10 days. We should not have done this, she said. The first real engagement happened 3 weeks after arrival. Zarek Vel sent his third-tier battle group to deal with the human defense fleet that had assembled in the upper atmosphere. Third tier was more than enough. He had used third tier to break the last 4 civilizations he had faced. Third tier was not even his best. Third tier was what you sent when the outcome was already decided, and you just needed someone to make it official. The engagement lasted 11 hours. It should have lasted 2. The human ships were older, smaller. They were not as fast and not as well armored. And in a straight fight, none of that mattered. The Vial battle group was bigger in every way that counted. But the humans didn't fight in a straight line. They fought in ways that the Vial tactical handbook did not have names for, because the handbook had been written by people who assumed the other side would try to survive the battle. The humans were trying to win it, which was a different thing, and the difference cost. 3 of the human ships, when they were badly damaged and should have retreated, rammed Vile cruisers at high speed instead. Not by accident, not in a panic, deliberately, with the crews still transmitting coordinating artillery for the ships behind them, calling in positions, talking to each other on open channels in calm voices, right up until the end. The Vale Battle Group won. Technically, the after-action report listed the cost, and Zarek Vel read it 3 times, because the number seemed wrong. A third-tier battle group engaging a primitive defense fleet of this size should not have come back with those kinds of losses. He had the tactical officer double-check the numbers. The numbers were correct. He filed the report. He did not say anything about it to his senior officers. He moved on to the next phase of the campaign. But that night, standing at the forward window, he pulled up the transmission records from the battle. He listened to the human ships talking to each other in the last minutes. He didn't know their language well enough to understand most of it, but the translator gave him fragments. He listened to a crew on a dying ship talking in calm, ordinary voices about firing angles and positions while their hull was failing around them. He turned the translator off. He stood at the window for a long time. The captured soldier was brought to him 2 days later. A Vale scout team, doing a ground insertion on the northern continent, had come across a small human military position and taken 1 prisoner. She was female. Not young, the translator estimated her age at somewhere between 35 and 45, which in human terms put her well into what should have been the middle of a comfortable life. She had 3 broken ribs, a wound on her arm that had been burned closed rather than properly treated, and a pattern of metal fragments across her face that would leave permanent marks. She was fully conscious. She was looking at the scout team with the calm, careful expression of someone who was counting them and thinking about the room. Sarith Ka was the one who interviewed her, because Sarith Ka was the one learning their language fastest. She went to the containment area with her translation device and her note-taking system, and the particular anxiety she had been living with since she opened the history file. The soldier asked for water. When Sarith Ka brought it, the soldier said thank you, correctly, formally, not the automatic politeness of someone in shock, the deliberate, precise politeness of someone who understood that how you treated the person in front of you mattered, even when the situation around you was terrible. She had learned how to say thank you in Vale. In the 48 hours since her capture, she had learned how to say thank you in their language. Sarith Ka sat across from her and looked at the woman, the broken ribs, the burned-shut wound, the metal in her face, and felt something she did not have a clean word for. Not pity, something closer to the feeling you get when you look at something and understand that you have been wrong about it in a way that cannot be fixed by simply learning the right answer. Does it hurt? Sarith Ka asked, because she had to start somewhere. The soldier looked at her. A small pause. Yes, she said. It does. You're not. Sarith Ka searched for the right word. You're not showing it. The soldier considered this for a moment. Then she said, simply, I know. Sarith Ka opened her file. She had 30 questions prepared. Tactical questions, cultural questions, questions designed to fill in the gaps in her intelligence picture. She got through 4 of them. Then, the soldier asked her a question instead. How many of you have fought a war against your own kind? Sarith Ka stopped. Not in the last 800 years, she said. The soldier nodded, not surprised, as if the answer was what she expected. That's the difference, the soldier said. That's all it is. Sarith Ka wrote this in her file. She didn't know what to do with it yet. She put it in the anomalies folder, which had become, at this point, the largest folder in her system. She went back to her quarters and sat in the dark and thought about what all the differences were worth. She had 3 reports to write. She had data to analyze. She had a picture of the species that was becoming, with every piece of information she added to it, something she did not want to have to describe to her commander. She wrote the reports anyway. The Biological Weapons Division made their proposal 4 weeks into the campaign. The director came to Zarek Vel with a professional face and a clean presentation. His division had developed a pathogen specifically engineered for human biology. It targeted a key protein in their cellular reproduction. It was, by every model they had, a fast and efficient solution. They had used a similar approach against the Korath Vi 7 years ago. The Korath Vi had not survived it. Zarek Vel approved the deployment. 3 days later, the pathogen was released in 3 target zones. The first reports were promising. Infection spreading at the expected rate. Symptoms presenting on schedule. A portion of the population sick, moving toward the projected outcome. Then the reports changed. 3 weeks after the initial release, the pathogen spread slowed. Then it stopped spreading as efficiently. The infected population was producing a defense, a biological counter that was, the division director explained with a face that had lost some of its professionalism. Not supposed to be possible at this speed. Zarek looked at the data. How fast? 3 weeks, the director said. For a pathogen, we spent 4 years developing. And the ones who were infected before the defense spread? The director's face did something complicated. Some of them died, he said. The others. He stopped. He looked at his data. The others recovered and went back to their units. Zarek looked at him. They recovered from a lethal pathogen and returned to active combat, he said. Yes, Commander. Within what time frame? The director looked like a man who wished he was somewhere else. Days, he said. In several documented cases, within 48 hours of fever breaking. Sarithka's anomalies folder now contained 612 separate entries. She sat in her cabin late one night and looked at the list. She had entries on the prisoners, on the battle records, on the biological weapons data, on 17 different specific incidents during ground engagements, where human soldiers had done things that didn't have a category in standard tactical analysis. She had a long entry on their military history, and an even longer entry on what happened to civilizations that lost, and then rebuilt, and then fought again. She had an entry she had written at 2 a.m, and then stared at for a long time before deciding to keep it. It said, "They have been practicing for this, not for us specifically, for something like us. For 10,000 years, they have been practicing for exactly this kind of war against something bigger and better equipped than themselves, and they have been losing that war over and over again inside their own borders, and getting up and trying differently, and losing again, and getting up again. And the ones who survived those wars survived because they were the ones who figured out how to fight when losing. We are not their first enemy. We are just the newest one." She closed the folder. She went to the forward observation room because she couldn't sleep and she needed to see something other than screens. She stood at the window and looked at the planet below. It was still lit up. The cities on the dark side were still on. The city she had watched disappear in the bombardment 3 weeks ago was the only dark spot. The rest were still burning. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and looked at all those small lights, and she thought about a species that looked up at 43 warships and responded in 40 minutes, and a general who chewed her pen and took notes in the margins of her own surrender terms. She thought about the soldier who had learned to say thank you in their language in 48 hours, who had broken ribs and a burned arm and metal in her face and was counting heads when they walked into the room, who had said, "That's the difference. That's all it is." Sarithka did not know, yet, what to do with the full weight of all of it. She was still building the picture. But she was a good analyst. She was good at seeing what a picture was becoming before it was finished. And the picture that was becoming clear to her, in the long quiet of the ship at night with the planet below and its stubborn burning lights, was not the picture of a civilization that was going to bend. She filed her next report in the morning. She labeled the last section, for the first time, not Times Conclusions Times, but Times Warning. She sent it to Zarek and went to get something to eat, and tried not to think too hard about whether anyone was going to listen to it. 6 months after the fleet arrived, Zarek stopped eating dinner in the command mess with his officers. He told them it was about scheduling. It wasn't about scheduling. It was because he had started to find the conversations unbearable in a way he couldn't explain without saying things he wasn't ready to say out loud. His officers were people he had served with for years, people who were good at their jobs, and they sat around the table every evening and talked about the campaign in the language of people who still believed the campaign was going the way it was supposed to go. He could not make himself sit there and speak that language anymore. The war was 6 months old. By every standard Zarek knew, a campaign against a civilization at this technological level should have been finished in 8 weeks, maximum 12, if the civilization in question was particularly stubborn at the start. The record for a non-peer civilization holding out against a Veil campaign was 4 months, and that species had the benefit of a planetary defense grid that took time to dismantle. Humans had no defense grid. They had no shields, no organized orbital platform. Nothing that should have made this last more than a few months. 6 months. They were still fighting, and the thing that Zarek turned over every night alone in his quarters was that they were getting better. The data was Sarithka's. She brought it to him in a quiet meeting in his office, just the two of them, with the door closed. She laid it out on his desk. Engagement records, month by month, 6 months of contact between Veil forces and human forces. She pointed to the trend line. In month 1, Veil forces in ground engagements won approximately 80% of the time. In month 2, 73%. In month 3, 67. In month 4, 60. In month 5, 54. She pointed to month 6, 49%. Zarek sat with that for a moment. The forces we're deploying haven't changed significantly, he said. No, Commander. So the change is on their side. Yes. He looked at the trend line. It was not a complicated mathematical picture. It went in one direction, steadily, at roughly the same rate each month. He was a man who had run 12 campaigns. He knew what trend lines did when you left them alone. How? He said. How are they improving at this rate? Sarith had been waiting for this question. She had been dreading it. Every engagement teaches them something, she said. They take their battle records and they analyze them, and then they train against what they learned, and then they fight differently. They have been doing this with each other for 10,000 years. They are. She paused. She chose the next words carefully. They are very good at learning how to fight a specific enemy. They've adapted their tactics to us. In 6 months, she said. Yes. And they've adapted their equipment. We've been tracking the output of their manufacturing facilities. And in the last 8 weeks, they've started producing weapons designed around Vial armor specifications. Not their old weapons, modified. New designs. Built for us. Zarek looked at the data quietly. They've been building weapons designed specifically to kill us, he said. Yes, Commander. In 6 months. They had existing industrial capacity, she said. And they've done this before. Redirected their entire manufacturing output to war production. They did it twice in the last century, against each other. They remembered how. She looked at her hands briefly. It appears to be something they know how to do from memory. Word came from the bioweapons division a week later. The pathogen was done. Not beaten done. The portion of the population it had infected had either died or recovered, and the ones who recovered had passed the biological response to the pathogen through their population so efficiently that it was now effectively neutralized. The division director submitted his report with the look of a man who was no longer sure what he was doing. He included a footnote. The footnote said, several human medical facilities that were treating pathogen cases continued to function without interruption throughout the infection period. Medical staff treated infected patients and then returned to treating battle wounds. No abandonment of posts was recorded in any monitored facility. He did not add any comment to the footnote. Zarek read it and understood that no comment was needed. The news from the Galactic Council reached him that same week. The Council had 14 member species. They had not, in 300 years of Veil expansion, ever intervened in a Veil campaign. They watched. They looked away. They made the calculation that looking away was easier than the alternative, and they lived with what that cost them quietly. It was an old arrangement. Everyone understood it. The Council's message was not intervention. It was observation. A Council observer vessel had taken up a neutral position above the Earth system 3 months into the campaign. It was allowed the Council had the legal right to observe any military engagement in explored space. Zarek had acknowledged the vessel and ignored it. He had observer vessels at campaigns before. They watched. They filed reports. They went home. The message from this observer was different. It was addressed not to Fleet Command but to the full Council, and it had been copied to Zarek fleet, which was unusual. It said, "This species is not defending. They are building. What we are watching is not a civilization in its final phase. The engagement at month 6 shows a force that has recalibrated to its opponent and is accelerating. The trajectory of this campaign has changed in a direction I would recommend all Council members note carefully. We thought the war cries were fear. They were the sound of a species remembering what it was born to do." Zarek read this message twice. He did not know who on the observer vessel had written it, but the line at the end had the quality of something that would be repeated for a long time. He felt its weight. He filed it. The engagement at the asteroid belt came in month 7. It was not supposed to be a significant engagement. A Veil advance force moving through the outer system came into contact with a human unit using the dense debris field of the asteroid belt as cover. Standard doctrine said to go around and cut off their retreat. The advance force commander made the standard decision. The human unit did not retreat. They used the debris field in a way that had no name in vile tactical doctrine. They used the asteroids themselves, large rocks, pulled by small maneuvering thrusters into calculated paths as weapons. They used the chaos of the field as protection, and they used it as a trap, and they held their position for 11 days. 11 days. Outnumbered, 4-1. Without resupply, without reinforcement, without any clear path to survival that a vile tactical officer looking at the situation could find. On the 11th day, a relief force arrived and the human unit disengaged. The relief force was not small. The after-action report from the advance force commander used words Zarek Vel had not read in a campaign report before. He used the word times unrecognizable, which was a tactical term that meant the enemy's behavior could not be categorized by existing doctrine. He used the word times deliberate, which in this context meant not times intentional times in the ordinary sense, but the specific military meaning, that the enemy had considered their situation fully and chosen their course of action without panic or confusion. The advance force commander also included something that was not standard in after-action reports. At the end, after the tactical analysis, he wrote a single personal observation that he did not explain or justify. He wrote, "I no longer know what they won't do." Zarek Vel went to the forward window on the night the asteroid belt report came through. He stood there for a long time. Below, the planet was the same as it had always been, the lights on the dark side, the cloud cover moving slowly across the surface. 7 months of this, 7 months of looking down at this planet and watching it not break. He thought about the campaign. He walked through it the way he walked through all his campaigns, from the beginning. The arrival, the ultimatum, the bombardment, the silence after the bombardment, the mobilization, every step after that. He was not a man who lied to himself. He had built his career on the ability to see things clearly, to look at a situation without the shape of what he wanted it to be getting in the way of the shape it actually was. He had made hard decisions in 12 campaigns because he was willing to see clearly. He was seeing clearly now. He thought about the trend line on Sirithka's chart. 49% in month 6. He did not need to calculate where that line went in month 12, if nothing changed. He thought about a soldier with broken ribs who had learned to say thank you in his language in 48 hours. He thought about Sirithka's note times they have been practicing for this times, and the 10,000 years of war written in their history, like a kind of long, terrible preparation for exactly the thing that was happening right now. He thought about the advance force commander's words. "I no longer know what they won't do." Neither did he. That was the truth he stood with at the window. He had led 12 campaigns. He knew his own capabilities in complete detail. He knew what his forces could do and how far they could be pushed, and what the limits were. He had always known those things about the enemy too, because all the enemies had been variations of the same type. Civilizations that had not been built for war, that had other priorities and other focuses and that hit a wall when they were pushed hard enough. Humans had no wall he could find, or if they did and he suspected they did, every species had one. He had no idea where it was. He had no idea what it would take to find it. He had no idea, and this was the thing he stood at the window with, whether finding it was something his fleet could still accomplish. He pressed his hand flat against the cold glass. Below, the lights burned. All of them, still burning. Month 7 of a campaign that should have been over in 8 weeks. And the lights were still on, and the weapons factories were running. And down there, somewhere in a room, or a ship, or a command post, General Amara Osei, who had chewed her pen and taken notes on her own surrender terms, was probably looking at data of her own. Zarek Vel wondered what her trend line looked like. He suspected he knew. He left the window. He went to his desk. He wrote 2 messages. One was to Fleet Command, marked with the level of classification that meant very few people would read it. The other was to Sirithka. The one to Fleet Command said that the campaign was not progressing as projected and that revised timelines were needed. He wrote it in the careful, formal language of reports, which meant it said less than it meant. Fleet Command would read the careful language and know he was telling them something. They would ask for more detail. He would provide it. The one to Sirithka was shorter. It said, "Keep the anomalies file. I need everything in it." He sent both messages and then he sat alone in the quiet of his office and thought about 43 campaigns and what they had taught him and what this one was teaching him that none of the others had. He sat there for a long time. On Earth, In a command facility on the west coast of the largest continent, General Amara Osei sat at a table with 6 of her senior officers and looked at the same trend line in reverse. Their line went up. Month by month, their win rate in direct engagements climbed. Their losses per engagement dropped. The supply lines were holding. The factories were running at full capacity. The soldiers who had survived the early months were teaching the ones who came after them. She looked at the data. She uncapped her pen. She wrote 2 words in the margin of the engagement summary. She circled them. She did not say them out loud. There was no need to say them out loud. Everyone in the room could see the line. Everyone in the room was doing the same quiet math. They had been here before. Not here exactly, not this war, not this enemy, but the shape of it, the long start, the terrible cost, the slow turn when the turn finally came. They had been in this shape of war more than once, and they knew what it felt like when the numbers started to move. They knew this feeling. Osei looked at the trend line one more time. She capped her pen. She put it down on the table, and she said to her officers, in the plain, direct voice of someone who was done waiting, "Start drawing up the next phase." The Vale sent their peace envoy 14 months after the fleet arrived. Her name was Velmara. She had conducted 17 surrender negotiations in her career for the Vile Dominion in 14 different systems. She was very good at her job. She wore her experience in the smooth, professional way of someone who had sat in difficult rooms many times and had never left one without getting what she came for. She had a draft treaty already written before she boarded her ship. She had written it the way she always wrote these things, a document that looked like a negotiation but was actually a more comfortable form of the original terms. The losing side would get to feel that they had argued for something and received something. The winning side would get everything they came for. Everyone would leave with their dignity approximately intact. This was the art of what she did, and she was proud of it, and she had never had any reason not to be. She read the campaign data on the way to the neutral station, all 14 months of it. She read it with the disciplined eye of someone who had read a lot of campaign data and understood it as background texture, the context that told you how stubborn the other side had been, and therefore how large a gesture of magnanimity you should make when you sat down with them. She read the first 3 months and made notes. She read months 4 through 8 and stopped making notes. She read months 9 through 14 very carefully, sitting very still, and she did not write anything down at all. When she arrived at the neutral station and stepped off her ship, and the aide who was meeting her asked if she needed anything before the summit began, she said she needed an hour alone. She spent that hour reading the data again. The meeting room was on the neutral station's 3rd level, a plain space with a long table, 2 sets of chairs, and a view through a wide window of the planet below and the scattered remains of what had been the Vile advance positions around it. The debris caught the light and made small, bright points in the dark, which was, Velmara thought when she walked in, a very unsubtle reminder of how the last 14 months had gone. She chose a seat. She arranged her documents. She folded her hands. The human delegation arrived. There was one of them, a single person, a woman, not young, wearing a dark suit and comfortable shoes. No military escort. No ceremonial armor. No display of any kind. She walked in the same way you walk into a meeting you have had 100 times before and find mostly tedious, looked at the room, and sat down across from Velmara. She put a small bag on the floor next to her chair. She poured water into both glasses. Then she looked at Velmara and said, "Thank you for coming," in accented but correct, Vale. Velmara studied her. Ambassador Yara Chen. The file said she had been a diplomat for 23 years. The file also said she had spent 4 of those years as a field medic before that, which was a combination Velmara found unusual enough to have read twice. "Thank you for the invitation," Velmara said carefully. "I hope the station is comfortable. We had limited time to prepare." Chen looked at the table, then at Velmara. She had the manner of someone who was genuinely trying to make the situation as easy as possible for the person across from her, which, under the circumstances, Velmara found disorienting. "I understand you've been traveling for some time." "I have," Velmara said. "Long journey," Chen said. "Yes. Do you need anything before we begin?" "We have." Chen reached into the small bag and put a thermos on the table. "I didn't know what you'd prefer to drink, so I brought an extra of what I have. It's coffee. You've probably encountered it. It's very..." She paused. "It's an acquired taste." Velmara looked at the thermos. She looked at the human woman who had apparently brought a warm beverage to a peace summit at the end of a war her species had just won. Thank you, she said. Any time, Chen said, and pushed the single folder across the table. Velmara opened the folder. She had her own draft treaty tucked at her side, ready. She was expecting to receive a counter to the original subjugation terms, or a list of opening demands that she would walk back toward something manageable. She was expecting the folder to be the beginning of a negotiation. It was not the beginning of a negotiation. It was a completed document, terms, fully written, ready for signature. She read the cover page. She turned to the first section. She read it slowly. Then she turned back to the beginning and read it again. The terms required the Vile Dominion to pay reparations for the destruction of the coastal city and for all other damage caused during the 14-month campaign. The reparations were large but not ruinous. They had been calculated, she could see from the numbers, against actual damages, rather than against what they could demand. The terms required the withdrawal of all Vale forces from the Earth system within 60 days. The terms included a demilitarized zone of a specific size around Earth's star system, which would be monitored by a Galactic Council observer. There was a section long, detailed, with many subsections requiring the Vile Dominion to hand over the complete cultural and historical records for every civilization they had subjugated, all 47, their languages, their histories, their art, what remained of them. This section was the longest part of the document by far. Velmara read it all. Then she sat with the document in her hands and looked at the table in front of her for a moment. She was looking for the part that wasn't there. There was no annexation of Vale territory, no demand for political control, no dissolved military, no tribute, no advisory roles, with no real power. None of the things that were in the original terms, the things she had assumed would simply be pointed back at the Vale. The way defeated powers were always given back a version of what they had tried to do to others. It wasn't there. She looked up at Yara Chen. Chen was drinking her coffee. She had both hands around the cup. She was watching Velmara with the calm, patient look of someone who knows they have handed someone something difficult and is giving them appropriate time. "You've won," Velmara said. The words came out very plain. Not diplomatic, just a true thing. "You've pushed us back. The engagement data, you know what it shows. You could take territory. You could demand our military's dissolution. You could write these terms the way we wrote ours." She looked at the document. "Why didn't you?" Chen put her coffee down. She was quiet for a moment. She turned her cup in her hands, once, and then she set it flat on the table. "Because we know what unreasonable costs," she said. Velmara waited for more. There wasn't more. "That's not a full answer," she said. "It's the honest one," Chen said. "We've been on the losing end of terms like yours before. Not with you, with ourselves. We've written surrender documents for each other. We've lived under them. We know what those terms make a civilization into. After." She looked at the folder on the table between them. "We're not interested in making the Vale into that. You'd rather have a Vile Dominion that's functional. I'd rather have a Vile Dominion that doesn't have a reason to come back." Velmara looked at her. "That's strategic," she said. "Yes," Chen said. "And it's also the right thing to do. It's mostly the right thing to do." There was a pause. "The cultural records section," Velmara said, turning to it. "The 47 civilizations." "Yes. Some of those records, the more complete ones, are classified under military access. It would take council review to release them. It would be. It's not a simple process." "I know," Chen said. "We've budgeted for it to take 5 years. There's a timeline in Appendix 3. She paused. "Those people existed. Their languages, their histories. Something of them should be kept somewhere that isn't a Vale military archive." Velmara looked at Appendix 3. There was indeed a timeline. It was detailed. It had been written by someone who had thought about this problem for a long time. She put the document down on the table. She had 17 negotiations behind her. She had a draft treaty at her side that was now irrelevant. She was sitting across from a human woman who had brought coffee to a peace summit and had apparently spent some portion of the last 14 months thinking about the cultural preservation of species the Vale had erased. She felt something that she did not immediately have a name for. "I need to contact Fleet Command," she said. "These terms need review at the command level before I can sign." "Of course," Chen said. She made a small gesture at the room. "Take whatever time you need. I'll be here." Velmara went to a private room on the upper level of the station and opened a secure channel to Fleet Command. Zarek Vel's face appeared on screen. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept well in several months. His eyes were steady, but there were shadows under them, and he was holding himself with the particular controlled stillness of someone managing a great deal. She gave him the summary of the terms. He listened without speaking. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. She asked about the 47 civilizations, he said. Yes, Commander. Another silence. Tell me your read of her, he said. Velmara thought about this. She brought coffee, she said finally. There was a long pause on the channel. Sign the treaty, Zarekvel said. They signed it 4 hours later. Velmara's aide prepared the formal copies. Chen's small team, she had 3 people with her, verified the language. The process was quiet and organized. The 2 of them signed the human copy and then the Vial copy and then the Council Observer's copy, which would go to the Council archive. When it was done, Velmara sat for a moment with the signed document in front of her. She thought about the 17 negotiations, the way they all had a shape, the posturing at the beginning, the moments where both sides tested the other, the point at which the outcome was clear, and the work became managing how it was framed. She had been good at that work. She had been proud of it. This had not had that shape. This had been a woman putting a completed document on a table and pouring water for both sides and waiting. Why a medic? Velmara asked. She was not sure where the question came from. It had been sitting in her mind since she read the file on the journey here. Before diplomacy, you were a field medic. Chen looked slightly surprised that she knew. Then she wasn't surprised. Yes, she said. That's an unusual path. Maybe, Chen said. Or maybe not. You spend enough time dealing with the cost of things going wrong. She stopped. She looked at the signed document on the table. You start to get very motivated to get things right earlier. Velmara looked at her for a moment. I have a question, she said. And I'm asking it as a person, not as a negotiator. All right. When you read our original terms, the subjugation terms we transmitted at the start, what did you write in the margins? Chen was still for a moment. The question had surprised her. Not uncomfortably more the way a question surprises you when it's the right one. She thought about it for a moment. Genuinely thought about it. In the way of someone going back to a memory. Notes about paragraph 14 mostly, she said. The collective punishment clause. I wanted to understand the logic of it, what it assumed about how civilizations work. She paused. And at the end I wrote a question. What was the question? Chen looked at the window, at the debris in the dark outside, catching the light. I wrote, do they know what they're starting? She was quiet for a moment. I had been hoping the answer was no. That it was a mistake of information, that they hadn't understood what we were. She looked back at Velmara. I spent a long time hoping that. Velmara said nothing. Anyway, Chen said. She began gathering her copies of the document. It's done now. Yes, Velmara said. It is. Outside the window, the debris caught the light and made its small cold points in the dark, and the planet below turned slowly, and the war was over. 20 years is a long time. It is long enough for a war to become history, long enough for history to become something that gets taught in schools and argued about by researchers and, eventually, reduced to a sentence or two in the kind of books that cover many centuries in a single volume, long enough for the people who lived through it to get old enough that the younger ones start to see them differently, not as people who made choices but as figures who belong to a past that feels very far away. 20 years is long enough for things to change. The Galactic Council now had 15 member species. Earth did not hold a standard seat. The Council had spent 8 months debating what kind of seat Earth should hold, because the existing categories didn't fit well. Full member implied peer status among all Council species, which was technically accurate but practically complex. Earth had already demonstrated that it occupied a different position than the others, in ways that were difficult to put into the existing structure. Observer status implied passivity, which was so clearly incorrect that the vote on that option lasted 4 minutes before it was rejected. In the end, they created a new category. The word for it in the Council's formal language translated, approximately, as times, guarantor, a species that held no territory claims within Council jurisdiction, sought no tribute or political control from any member, and whose role was, simply, to ensure that the Council's agreements were honored. No one asked what happened if they weren't honored. No one needed to. Dr. Marcus Webb had an office on the Council station with a window that looked out at the star field on the station's quiet side, away from the docking bays and the traffic. He liked it because it was almost always still. In 12 years working on the station, first as a junior liaison, now as the senior human representative, he had done most of his best thinking in that stillness. He was sitting at his desk on a Tuesday morning, working through a trade dispute between two council members that had been dragging for 6 weeks. When the knock came at his open door, he looked up. The veiled diplomat was young, 23, maybe 24 years old, which in veil terms put him firmly in the early part of his career. He had a sharp, careful face, and the kind of posture that said he was trying to look more certain than he felt. He was carrying a data pad and wearing the formal diplomatic colors, which on a young diplomat always looked slightly too large for them, the way formal clothing does when you haven't grown into what it represents yet. His name was Sile Rin. Webb had met him 6 months ago, when Sile Rin was assigned to the council station. He had a reputation for asking the questions that his supervisors tended to find inconvenient. "Dr. Webb," he said, "do you have a few minutes?" Webb gestured at the chair across from his desk. "Sit down." Sile Rin sat. He put the data pad on his knee. He did not look at it. He had the air of someone who had been thinking about a conversation for a while, and had come to have it. Webb waited. "I've been reading the war history," Sile Rin said. "Okay," Webb said. "The full archive, not the summary, the engagement records, the intelligence files, the negotiation transcripts." He paused. "Ambassador Chen's notes from the treaty session." "She kept good notes," Webb said. "She kept very detailed notes." Sile Rin was quiet for a moment. "The terms she offered. I've read them many times. I've been looking for the strategic logic." He looked at Webb. "We didn't deserve those terms." Webb leaned back in his chair. "No," he said. "You didn't." Then why?" Sile Rin said. Not the practiced neutrality of a diplomat, a genuine question from someone who had been sitting with it and could not resolve it alone. "You had won. The terms you offered us, you could have taken territory. You could have done to us what we did to 47 other civilizations. The math worked." "The math worked," Webb agreed. "So why didn't you?" Webb looked at the window, the star field, still and dark and very large. He had been asked versions of this question before by journalists, by researchers, by other council members who had their own reasons for wanting to understand it. He had different answers for different contexts. The strategic one, which Yara Chen had given Velmara in the treaty room, unreasonable terms create reasons to come back. The political one, Earth needed allies, not subjects. The historical one, it had been tried the other way, and the result was on record. He didn't give Sile Rin any of those answers. He thought about the 3 wars he had served in before becoming a diplomat. He thought about a field hospital in the dark, the particular stillness of it when the shooting had stopped and there was just the work of what came after. He thought about what you understood about cost when you spent years watching it up close. What you understood about what was worth it and what wasn't. "Someone had to," he said. Sile Rin looked at him. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have that's true." "That's not," Sile Rin stopped. He looked at the data pad on his knee. He set it on the desk carefully and looked at it, and then looked back at Webb. "We killed 1.5 million people in 4 minutes, at the start. We deployed biological weapons. We did those things, and at the end you offered us terms that let us function. That let us keep our government, our military structure, our territory. You asked for money and cultural records." He shook his head slightly. "How does someone make that decision?" "Badly," Webb said. "Slowly. With a lot of argument." He looked at Sile Rin. "There were people who wanted the other terms. There were people who said the math worked and we should use it. They weren't wrong about the math. They were arguing in good faith." He was quiet for a moment. "Amara Ose made the case for what we did instead. She was in the room when it mattered, and she made the case." "What did she say?" Webb thought about it. "She said we were not going to do to you what you had done to others, and then live with what we became if we did." He paused. "And then she said something I've thought about a great deal. She said, we don't get to decide that mercy is worth giving after we've decided if we want to give it. We have to decide we're the kind of people who give it before the question comes up. Otherwise it isn't mercy, it's just strategy, with a better name." Sile Rin was quiet. "The Veiled Dominion," he said, after a moment, "is different now than it was 20 years ago." "I know," Webb said. "The species we subjugated, some of the ones that survived, we've been in contact with them, through the cultural records process. Some of them have opened communication." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "It's complicated. It is a very complicated set of conversations, but they are happening." "I know," Webb said again. I think, that is partly because of the terms." Because we were left functional enough to address it. He looked at Webb. I have thought about this a great deal. I imagine you have. I wanted to tell you, Sailrin said. It came out less formal than anything else he had said, more direct. I wanted to tell someone who was there, who was involved in it, that it mattered, that things are different because of the choice that was made. Webb looked at him for a long moment. I'll tell Osei, he said. She'll want to hear it. Sailrin nodded. He picked up his datapad. He stood. He was at the door when he turned back, and for a moment he was not a young diplomat trying to look certain he was just a young person standing in a doorway. Do you think it was worth it? He asked. The war. What it cost. For the result that came out of it. Webb thought about it for a moment. He thought about the real answer, the honest one. I think the war was a catastrophe, he said. I think 1.5 million people died in 4 minutes, and that is an event that should not have happened. I think we lost people we shouldn't have lost, and we did things in those 14 months that we will argue about for a long time. He paused. And I think what came after what you're describing is real. Both of those things are true at the same time. I've had to learn to hold both of them. Sailrin nodded. He left. Webb sat with his starfield and his trade dispute documents, and the quiet of the station still sighed, and he thought about Amara Osei, who was retired now and lived somewhere on the East Coast with a garden she sent him photographs of occasionally, and about Yara Chen, who was on Earth now too, consulting, with the particular busy and retirement quality of people who don't know how to stop working, and about Sarith Ka, who had become one of the most cited analysts in council history, and who had once told him that the anomalies folder was still the organizing framework she used for everything she didn't yet have a category for. He went back to the trade dispute. The alert came 3 weeks later. It arrived during a full council session, 14 species plus the Earth representation, arranged around the circular chamber in their respective sections, in the middle of a discussion about navigation rights in a sector that 3 of them shared borders on. The alert was flagged by the Council's Outer System Monitoring Network, and it appeared on every member's display simultaneously. A new FTL signature, Origin, a system approximately 40 light-years from the Council's outer boundary. Unknown species. They had achieved FTL travel within the last several years. They had found the Council's communication network, and they had sent, as their first message into that network, an aggressive probe, signal a declaration of territory, a challenge, the kind of message a species sends when it wants to establish very early that it is not afraid of whatever it might find. The council chamber went still, not the still of surprise, the still of recognition. Every species in that room had a history. Some of those histories included the moment of first contact, the calculation of what was out there and whether to be afraid. Some of those histories included what happened when the calculation went wrong. They all read the signal. Nobody spoke. On the council's display, the new species home system was highlighted. Their signal was replaying. It was, by any technical measure, clear and deliberate. A species that was young and had just found the stars, and had decided, in that first loud moment, that they were going to declare themselves before anything else could. Webb looked at the signal for a long time. He thought about 43 ships appearing above a blue planet. He thought about 6 hours that became 40 minutes. He thought about a general with a chewed pen writing in margins. He thought about all the things this new species did not know yet about what was out here, and about the 47 civilizations in the Council archive whose histories were slowly, carefully, being reconstructed, and about a coastal city that was gone. He thought about what it cost to learn. The Vile ambassador stood. He was older than when Webb had first met him. Zarek Vel had retired years ago, and the ambassador now was a different person, younger, who had come up through the changed dominion that the last 2 decades had built. But he had read the archive. He had read all of it. He stood, and he looked across the chamber at Marcus Webb. The room was very quiet. Shall we inform them? The Vale ambassador said. Webb looked at the signal on the display one more time, at the aggressive tone of it, at the coordinates of the system that had sent it, at all the confidence in it, the loud first-breath confidence of a species that had just opened a door and decided to walk through it like it owned the hallway. He knew how this went. He had been on the other side of it. Send them our full diplomatic package, he said. He was quiet for a moment. And a map. Mark the asteroid belt at Proxima Centauri's second body. The Vale ambassador looked at him. Something moved in his expression, something that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, but sat in the space between them. He nodded. The council's communications officer began composing the message. Around the chamber, the 14 species sat with the particular weight of people who had learned something at significant cost, and were now watching someone else about to begin the same lesson. There was nothing comfortable about that weight. There was nothing satisfying about it. It was just the thing you carried when you had been somewhere and knew the road. Webb looked at the starfield through the chamber's far window. Out there, 40 light-years away, a species that didn't know what it had done yet was waiting to see what would answer their signal. Something would answer. Something patient and experienced and not unkind. They would find out, in time, what they had started. And then if things went the way Webb hoped they could, if the choice was made the right way when it had to be made, they would find out something else. Something harder to learn. Something that lasted longer. He looked at the display where their signal was still replaying, and he thought about a garden on the East Coast, and an old general who grew tomatoes now and sent him photographs, and about all the things that were possible on the other side of a war if you were willing to choose them. The message was sent. The stars were very still. The work continued.